Friendsify you watch super hit movie Day 5 Bloods in English, then you must like this video. If you are visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Friends, in today's video, the movie we're going to talk about is called Da 5 Bloods. We will talk about what this movie is and where you can watch it, all the interesting facts about this movie in today's video. I'm going to tell you, I am also going to give you all the information on which platform or on which satellite channel you will get to watch this movie. Also, we will talk in detail about the technical department, music department, pre-production filming, post-production budget, box office collection of this film. We will also talk about the story of this film, and I will also give you a small review of the story of this film. Apart from this, we will discuss about the facts of this film's storyline, star cast actors' performance in the film, and which character has played which role. That's why I request you friends to watch this video till the end. So let's start the video. Da 5 Bloods is a 2020 American war drama film directed, produced, and co-written by Spike Lee. It stars Delroy Lindo, Jonathan Majors, Clarke Peters, Johnny Tree Nguyen, Norm Lewis, Isiah Whitlock Jr., Melanie Thierry, Paul Walter Hauser, Jasper Payekinen, Jean Reno, and Chadwick Boseman in his last movie released during his lifetime. The film's plot follows a group of 4 aging Vietnam War veterans who return to the country in search of the remains of their fallen squad leader, as well as the treasure they buried while serving there. Originally written by Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo in 2013, the script was reworked by Lee and Kevin Wilmot following the pair's successful collaboration in BlacKkKlansman 2018. The cast joined in February 2019 and filming began a month later, lasting through June and taking place in Southeast Asia. With a production budget of $35–45 million, it is among Lee's most expensive films. The film was released by Netflix on June 12, 2020. It received acclaim from critics who praised the direction, themes, and the performances of Lindo, Peters, and Boseman, with many considering it among Lee's best works. The film received numerous accolades, including nominations for the Academy Award for Best Original Score and Screen Actors Guild Award for Outstanding Performance by a Cast in a Motion Picture, and was named by the National Board of Review as the best film of 2020. Plot: during the Vietnam War, a squad of black U.S. Army soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division, Paul, Otis, Eddie, Melvin, and their squad leader Norman, who dubbed themselves the Bloods, secure the site of a CIA airplane crash and recover its cargo, a locker of gold bars intended as payment to the Lahu people for their help in fighting the Viet Cong. The Bloods decide to take the gold for themselves and bury it so they can retrieve it later. However, in the ensuing Vietnamese counterattack, Norman is killed, and the Bloods cannot locate the buried gold after a napalm strike obliterates the identifying landmarks. In the present day, Paul, Otis, Eddie, and Melvin meet up in Ho Chi Minh City. A recent landslide had uncovered the tail of the crashed plane, and with this new information, they plan to find the gold and Norman's body. Otis reunites with his old Vietnamese girlfriend Tien, who reveals that he is the father of her grown child. Tien introduces the Bloods to Desroche, a French businessman who agrees to help the Bloods smuggle the gold out of Vietnam once they retrieve it. Soon thereafter, they are joined by Paul's son David, who has a tempestuous relationship with his father. Vin, a tour guide hired by the Bloods, leads the group out into the countryside, where a confrontation with a local merchant forces Paul to admit that he has post-traumatic stress disorder. At a hotel bar, David meets Hetty, the founder of LAM, an organization dedicated to clearing landmines. The next day, Vin drops off the group and tells them he will pick them up in a few days. During their first night, Paul confiscates a pistol from Otis, which had been secretly given to him by Tien, and becomes suspicious of his motives. Eventually, the Bloods find the gold bars scattered across the side of a hill. They also find Norman's remains and pray over them. Eddie reveals that his excessive spending has rendered him broke, but reminds the Bloods of Norman's original plan to give the gold to their black brethren in the United States. On the hike out, Eddie steps on a landmine and is killed. David also steps on a mine but does not trigger it, just as Hetty and 2 other volunteers from LAM, Simon and Seppo, show up. Paul and the others manage to pull David off the mine safely. Paul then holds the three outsiders hostage with Otis's gun, paranoid that they will report them to the authorities. During the night, Seppo escapes, while David and the others forcibly disarm Paul. When the Bloods regroup with Vin, a group of gunmen shows up demanding the gold in exchange for Seppo, whom they have captured. In the ensuing shootout, David is shot in the leg, and Seppo is killed by a landmine. All of the gunmen are killed except for one, who flees. Assuming that Desroche has crossed them, Vin suggests retreating to a nearby abandoned temple to defend themselves from reinforcements. Unwilling to trust Vin, Paul takes his share of the gold and heads out into the jungle alone. The remaining Bloods offer Vin, Hetty, and Simon a share of the remaining gold for their trouble. As he rages to himself, Paul has a vision of Norman, who reminds Paul that he was the one who had accidentally killed Norman during a firefight and that he should let go of his guilt. He is subsequently located and killed by Desroche's men. Desroche, now wearing Paul's MAGA hat, arrives with the gunmen at the temple and is then ambushed by Otis, Melvin, and Vin. All of his men are subsequently killed. Desroche wounds Otis and tries to finish him off with a hand grenade, but Melvin sacrifices himself by leaping on top of it. As Desroche prepares to execute Otis, David shoots and kills him with Otis's gun. Vin helps the surviving Bloods share out the gold. Melvin's widow receives his share, and Eddie's goes to a Black Lives Matter organization. Hetty and Simon donate their shares to Lamb in Seppo's name. Norman's remains are brought home to his family by the military. David reads a letter from Paul, who tells him that he will always love him. Otis visits Tien and bonds with his daughter for the first time.
Guest:
Delroy Lindo as Paul, Jonathan Majors as David, Clarke Peters as Otis, Norm Lewis as Eddie, Isiah Whitlock Jr. as Melvin, Johnny Tringwin as Ving, Melanie Thierry as Hetty Bouvier, Paul Walter Hauser as Simon,
Jasper Päkkönen as Seppo Havelin,
Chadwick Boseman as Stormin Norman Earl Holloway, Veronica Ngo as Hanoi Hannah, Jean Reno as Desroche,
Legus Lennerstien, Nguyen Ngoch Lamasquan, Sandy Huang Pham as Mission.
Production, development, and casting. The film was originally a 2013 spec script by Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo titled The Last Tour, with Mike Bundley and Barry Levine executive producing and with Oliver Stone set to direct. 4. Stone dropped out in 2016, and in 2017 producer Lloyd Levin pitched the script to Spike Lee, who performed a rewrite with Kevin Wilmot. The two changed the film to an African-American perspective, added the film's flashback sequences, and expanded the role of the Stormin Norman character. For his research, Lee credited Wallace Terry's 1984 book Bloods, an oral history of the Vietnam War by black veterans, as particularly helpful, and assigned it to the film's actors. Samuel L. Jackson, Denzel Washington, Giancarlo Esposito, and John David Washington were initially cast in the lead roles but dropped out due to scheduling conflicts. 5. In February 2019, it was announced that Netflix would distribute the film, with Chadwick Boseman, Delroy Lindo, and Jean Reno set to star. Jonathan Majors entered negotiations to join later that month. In March 2019, Paul Walter Hauser, Clarke Peters, Isiah Whitlock Jr., Norm Lewis, Melanie Thierry, and Jasper Päkkönen joined the cast of the film. Esposito was also confirmed for the cast, although he later dropped out. This was the final film release of Chadwick Boseman during his lifetime. Filming began on March 23, 2019. Production lasted 3 months, mostly shooting in Ho Chi Minh City, Bangkok, and Chiang Mai. The ruins where an action sequence takes place, meant to represent the Mi-sun temples, were a specifically constructed set built by the film crew using wood and styrofoam in a period of 2 months. Unlike other films, including Netflix's The Irishman, Lee had the main cast, most of whom were in their 60s, play the 20-year-old versions of themselves in flashback sequences without the use of de-aging technology or makeup, bar for the final shot of their younger versions. Lee considered it an effective way to visually show that the aged characters remain trapped in the wartime memories, stating, "The Five Bloods uses 4 aspect ratios as framing devices which distinguish between the film's different time periods and locations. The 1960s flashback sequences were shot in 1.331 format on 16mm film, mimicking newsreel footage of the time. Cinematographer Newton Thomas Sigel, who proposed the idea, stated, "Vietnam was the first war that was really televised, and it was predominantly shot with 16mm. It's how the American public perceived the war." Netflix executives initially were resistant to the proposal given the challenges it presented, but Lee was adamant and was eventually allowed to proceed. With the exception of a brief scene filmed using a Super 8 camera in 2.391 ratio, the modern scenes were shot digitally. The present-day city scenes were framed in widescreen 2.39:1 ratio, evoking the aesthetics of David Lean's epics, such as Lawrence of Arabia. The present-day jungle scenes were captured in 1.851 ratio as Lee and Sigel sought to envelop the group with the vastness of the jungle. Music? Main article, Da 5 Bloods soundtrack. The musical score for Da 5 Bloods was written by composer Terence Blanchard. In addition to Blanchard's score, the film features several songs from the early 1970s. Most predominantly, the film contains 6 songs from Marvin Gaye's 1971 album, What's Going On? That record was released when I was young, but I could feel what was going on in the country, said Blanchard. When Spike has that music put in a film, it becomes extremely powerful for so many reasons. The 6 main characters share the same first names as the members of The Temptations and their producer Norman Whitfield. A soundtrack album was released by Milan Records on June 5, 2020. Release: Da 5 Bloods was released on June 12, 2020 by Netflix 1920. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the film was originally scheduled to premiere out of competition at the 2020 Cannes Film Festival, then play in theaters in May or June before streaming on Netflix. Reception: commercial response. Upon release, it was the top-streamed film in its first weekend, before falling to 6th place in its second. At their Q2 report meeting in July 2020, Netflix reported the film had been viewed by 27 million households since its release. In November, Variety reported the film was the 16th most-watched straight-to-streaming title of 2020 up to that point. In March 2021, Variety reported the film was among Netflix's most-watched Oscar-nominated titles and assigned it an audience appeal score of 81 out 100. Critical response. On review aggregator website Rotten Tomatoes, the film holds an approval rating of 92% based on 303 reviews, with an average rating of 8/10. The site's critical consensus reads, "Fierce energy and ambition course through Da 5 Bloods, coming together to fuel one of Spike Lee's most urgent and impactful films." On Metacritic, the film has a weighted average score of 82 out of 100, based on 49 critics, indicating universal acclaim. Writing for the Chicago Sun-Times, Richard Roper gave the film 4 out of 4, saying, "The picture, the script, and director Lee all deserve nomination consideration, as does the lush and booming score by Lee's longtime collaborator Terence Blanchard. Whitlock, Lewis, Peters, and Bozeman deserve supporting actor conversation, while Delroy Lindo should be an instant contender for Best Actor." Richard Brody of The New Yorker wrote that the film runs 2 hours and 34 minutes, but it's not a second too long. On the contrary, it feels compressed, bustling, and frenzied with its intellectual and dramatic energy. David Rooney of The Hollywood Reporter called the film as timely as today's news, writing, "Lee deftly steers it all full circle in a series of brief wrap-up scenes that are both fancifully tidy and deadly serious, acknowledging the Black Lives Matter movement in a way that allows this sprawling, unwieldy, frequently brilliant film to close on a profoundly affecting note of hope and catharsis. Structural flaws notwithstanding, this movie is a gift right now, and there's no other director that could have made it." Eric Cohn of IndieWire gave the film a grade of B and wrote, "A loose, caustic look at the Vietnam War through the prism of black experiences, Da 5 Bloods wrestles with the specter of the past through the lens of a very confusing present and settles into a fascinated jumble as messy and complicated as the world surrounding its release." Writing for Variety, Peter DeBrue called the film ambitious but uneven, and said that Lee interweaves potent social critique with escapist B-movie thrills as four veterans return to Nam to claim the loot they were ordered to retrieve decades earlier, but stashed for themselves instead. The result is overlong and erratic, but also frequently surprising, propelled by an unforgettable turn from Delroy Lindo. Ann Hornaday of the Washington Post gave the film 3 out of 4, writing that its moments of stinging insight and soaring cinematic rhetoric once again prove why Spike Lee might be America's most indispensable filmmaker. Critic Mark Kermode called the film a mixed bag. Writing for The Guardian, he gave the film 3 out of 5, praising its political and comedic aspects as well as Lindo's performance, but wrote negatively of its tonal shifts, noting that warring elements of Da 5 Bloods appear bolted together. Chuck Bowen of Slant Magazine gave the film 2.5 out of 4, concluding, "At its best, Da 5 Bloods offers a damning, impassioned, hallucinatory collage of images and ideas concerning the relationship between racism and warfare with superb performances. At its worst, it's a vibrant mess." Da 5 Bloods appeared on 77 critics' year-end top 10 lists, including 10 first-place rankings and 6 second-place ones. From U.S.-based Vietnamese writers, in an article for the New York Times, Pulitzer-winning novelist Viet Thanh Nguyen expressed his mixed feelings. He notes that even with a new central perspective of black soldiers and justified messaging, the film still reanimates tropes such as victimizing Vietnamese and being America-centric. He said, "If one can't disentangle black subjectivity from dominant American white subjectivity, it's impossible to apply a genuine anti-imperialist critique." Hence, the marginalized Vietnamese continuing to serve their role as excuses for a black drama staged against America's black-white divide. Hoai Tran Bui echoes similar perspectives in her analysis for the blog Film, saying Lee's work is haunted by, even enamored with, the legacy of Apocalypse Now. Still, she notes, Lee does take steps to undercut past Hollywood depictions of the Vietnamese people as faceless victims, referencing the major presence of the tour guide character Vin and the rare focus on Amerasian children. For the publication Awards Watch, Nguyen Le sees many areas of the film in an imperfect but commendable way, a departure from Hollywood's constant portrayal of Vietnam as nothing more than a war. He also wonders the possibility of Vietnamese communities no longer hyper-entrenching themselves in wartime memories and instead focusing on combating anti-black racism from within and without. As the end of Da 5 Bloods shows, there are more important issues to tend with than the past. Sometimes it's because we have finished confronting it, he wrote. Spike Lee's excellent Da 5 Bloods opens with Muhammad Ali and closes with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., two legends who are inextricably tied to the civil rights movement and black pride. Lee uses them to highlight another commonality, their strenuous opposition to the Vietnam War. For Ali, the objection cost him several productive years of his career and his heavyweight title. For Dr. King, this new focus was quite possibly the final straw that led to his assassination. The first words we hear are Ali's famous explanation of why he refused to enlist. The last words we hear are from a speech King gave on April 4, 1967, exactly 1 year before his murder, where he quotes poet Langston Hughes, "Let America be America again." Between these two bookends is a heist movie of sorts, albeit one with far more on its mind than its plot details would suggest. Lee is one of the few directors who takes to heart Godard's comment that, in order to criticize a movie, you have to make another movie. There is critique here, especially of films like The Green Berets, Rambo, and Missing in Action, with one character joking about how Hollywood went back to Vietnam to try winning the war on screen. There's also commentary on just how white these movies were, with people like Chuck Norris and Sylvester Stallone achieving mythic glory while blithely erasing the fact that 32% of the soldiers in the jungle were black. It's this type of whitewashing of veterans that Lee chips at with his cast and his story. The same type that would allow an NFL quarterback to imply that his white grandfathers were more patriotic than the soldiers of color who fought in the war with them, yet came home to inferior circumstances. Running in parallel with these criticisms are blatant homages to other films. And not just war movies like Apocalypse Now, which gets a visual name check as the main characters do a pseudo-Soul Train line boogie to Marvin Gaye's Got to Give It Up. A big chunk of Da 5 Bloods pays tribute to John Huston's masterful 1948 adaptation of B. Travin's classic parable of greed, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Like that film, the plot involves a search for gold. Though, unlike Humphrey Bogart and John's dad, Walter, the main characters here have a good idea where the treasure is. The loot has also already been turned into more palatable and recognizable gold bars. As in films like Inside Man and Black Klansman, Lee unabashedly quotes his influences. He knows that you know what he's doing, and he milks that for as much mileage as he can. Steal from the best, as the adage goes, and treasure is a vein worth mining. So there's a nod to Walter Huston's joyous gold discovery dance, and Vietnamese bandits dare to paraphrase that line about not needing any stinking badges. The gold itself is just as big a MacGuffin. Except here, it's also a deus ex machina of sorts, pulling out of the ether a note of hopeful uplift that ties the fictional story to a much-desired reality-based outcome that's almost too good to believe, but wonderful to behold. In lesser hands, the occasional messiness of the script by Lee, his fellow Oscar-winning Black Klansman scribe Kevin Wilmot, and Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo might result in a film weakened by its occasional predictability. But Lee has always been a master of using the cinematic tropes that have always worked as an okey-doke. The left hand lures you in with the familiar before the right hand blindsides you with the unexpected punching power of the intended point. Yes, the tapestry portrays a simple scene, yet upon closer inspection, one realizes that its threads have been woven with complexity. This director knows the power of captivating an audience, so he can goad them into sticking around for his message. So on the surface, we have the story of 4 Vietnam vets who have returned to the country that bonded them in battle to claim a treasure they buried several decades ago. The men themselves initially seem to fit the usual types. There's the Joker, Melvin, Isiah Whitlock Jr., the level-headed medic, Otis, Clarke Peters, and the one who achieved the most post-war success, Eddie, Norm Lewis. Rounding out the quartet is the forceful, hot-headed leader, Paul, played by Delroy Lindo in one of the best performances to come out of a Spike Lee joint. The 5th blood of the title is not Paul's son, David, Jonathan Majors, who unexpectedly shows up to join his elder's crew, but their fallen comrade and squad leader, Norman, whose body they have been authorized to exhume so as to not raise suspicions about their other intentions. They will be assisted, at least to the base of their jungle journey, by Vin, Johnny Tree Nguyen, a trustworthy guide who provides context from his side of what he calls the American War. He was like a religion to your father, Otis tells his godson David, who informs us that Paul's PTSD has him calling out Norman's name in his sleep. The Bloods gave their leader the nickname Stormin' Norman, and he is spoken about in the reverent tones one reserves for folk heroes. In a perfect casting move, Stormin' Norman is played by Black Panther himself, Chadwick Boseman. After playing real-life black legends like James Brown, Thurgood Marshall, and Jackie Robinson, not to mention the fictional king of Wakanda, Boseman doesn't need to overplay his mythical status. A shot of him just shooting the shit with an afro pick rising up from the back of his head carries enough unapologetic blackness to power a nuclear reactor of revolution. It is he who educates the Bloods on the history of black and brown people dying for a country that doesn't love them back, starting with Crispus Attucks and ending with Milton Olive III, who dove on a grenade to save his platoon and was the first African American awarded the Medal of Honor in Vietnam. Stormin' Norman also puts the trunk of gold bars they discover in a downed CIA plane into context. He sees it as much-deserved reparations, a repurposing of funds that were originally slated for Vietnamese people who provided information to the U.S. That gold can't leave Vietnam in its current condition, so outside forces are necessary to assist. Otis reconnects with Tien Lei Lan, a former sex worker with whom he had a relationship during his tours of duty. Tien is now a major financial broker who puts him in touch with a shady French businessman named Desroches Jean Reno. He's expensive, she tells Otis before naming his price of 20% of the take. Into this expected heist movie scene, Lee introduces the topic of children who have been fathered by American GIs during wars, with Peters and Land playing the sequence in beautiful understatement before returning us back to the main story. Several times, Lee will engage in these sorts of tangents, either with plot or real-life images and footage edited into the film. The latter device is worked seamlessly into the narrative, sometimes to shocking and heart-rending effect. And it often draws parallels, as Ali's speech does in the first scene, between the poor Vietnamese citizens and the poor blacks sent to fight them. Lee also works in ties between the French, who tried their hand at Vietnam, and the Americans, who, to quote Otis, tried to feed us that anti-commie Kool-Aid. Uncle Sam did no better in Vietnam than the French did, Desroche tells Paul after the latter goes off on him regarding French weakness. Oddly enough, Lee's penchant for wonderfully crazy monikers for his characters is relegated to Renos. French speakers will benefit from a great visual play on Desroche later in the film. Paul would rather do business with anyone else, but this is the hand they're dealt, so the Bloods choose to play it. Soon, they will also encounter other French people, including Hetty Bouvier, Melanie Thierry, an heiress-turned-landmine expert whom David becomes sweet on, and her colleagues Simon, Paul Walter Hauser, and Seppo Jasper Packanen, all of whom will become involved once the violent action movie elements of the film come into play. Paul hates the French, the Vietnamese, hell, everybody practically. He's anti-immigrant, and in what is no doubt a troll on the director's part, Paul voted for the man an on-screen caption refers to as President Fake Bone Spurs. Paul even says, "There were atrocities on both sides." As far as trolling goes, however, Lee is playing the long game here. Paul may be MAGA, and the red hat he wears in the jungle is an image ripe with shade. The hat went to Vietnam. Its symbolic representation stayed home. But he is also the most complex character in Da 5 Bloods, a mix of rage, anger, and hurt exacerbated by the war and the guilt it seared into his soul. Paul was with Stormin' Norman when he died, and it's easy to figure out what happened long before the truth is revealed. But again, that's the well-worn path Lee travels to get to the heretofore underrepresented on-screen depiction of black post-war trauma and its effects on friends and family alike. These effects are realized in a fantastic monologue delivered mostly in close-up by Lindo. Again, Lee takes a cue from Treasure of the Sierra Madre, but while Houston had Bogey wandering the mountains muttering to himself while in the thrall of paranoia driven by greed, Lee has Paul rant at the United States government while looking at the viewer. Lindo's scene isn't a descent into madness. It's an ascent towards self-realization, filtered through angry howls of defiance. This arc reaches its apex in a moment of cathartic exorcism that gives way to a moment of darkly comic punishment courtesy of a well-placed snare trap. "God, you a trickster!" yells Paul, evoking the fabled character of African myth. Da 5 Bloods jumps back and forth, though not too many times, between the Bloods' tours of duty and the present day. In those flashbacks, all 4 older actors play themselves without benefit of the de-aging CGI that plagued The Irishman. At first, it's rather jarring, but I bought into the visual of these characters stepping through the looking glass armed with the knowledge their younger incarnations did not have. They've come back to a place that, as Vin points out, they figuratively never left. It haunts them forever. "I see ghosts," Paul says at one agonized point, and though the ghost he sees is Norman, the real specter in the room is the war itself. You have to think long and hard to come up with a movie that focuses so intently on the aftermath of war on black soldiers. Mudbound and Dead Presidents come to mind, but they also have other stories to tell. In addition to the verbal commentary about present events versus past ones, Lee also employs some sly visual representations of his points. David wears a Morehouse shirt throughout his jungle trek, and it's more than just a shout-out to the director's alma mater. It's a reminder that the college kids didn't wind up in this location. "They put our poor black asses out here on the front line," says Melvin, "killing us like flies." With the occasional jump to graphic documentary footage, we're also reminded that the Vietnam War was beamed into the homes of millions of Americans via the nightly news. forcing them to see the atrocities in such an effective way that later wartime presidents forced a moratorium on images of war, as if out of sight meant out of mind. As expected, Lee gets excellent performances out of his cast straight down the line and is unafraid to coax out moments of love and affection to undercut the expected machismo of his bloods. Whitlock presents yet another hilarious iteration of his persona. Lewis exudes a confidence that is clearly hiding a sadder truth. Majors is as revelatory as he was in The Last Black Man in San Francisco, and Peters is a very effective voice of reason. As the women in this outfit, Lan and Thierry acquit themselves nicely with a toughness tempered with warmth. But this superb haunting contraption belongs to Delroy Lindo, whose complicated work here almost rivals Denzel Washington's turn in Malcolm X. Lee always knows how to play the actor's size and toughness alongside and against his vulnerability, and Lindo has never been afraid to plumb the depths of raw, naked emotion that would terrify actors worried about what constitutes a manly image. There is plenty of action, both in wartime and during the present day, which keeps the movie moving through its 157-minute runtime. Cinematographer Newton Thomas Sigel handles it well, shooting some extraordinarily gorgeous and horrific images while fiddling with the aspect ratio in ways I found too clever to be annoyed with. One change occurs during an old-fashioned wipe, while another manifests itself with a dramatic opening of the screen. If Sigel is the MVP of the imagery, Terence Blanchard and Marvin Gaye rule the soundtrack. Blanchard's score is bombastic, terrifying, and militaristic one minute, achingly beautiful the next, and Lee's use of Gaye's songs, primarily from the What's Going On album, is aces, especially in a chilling a cappella rendering of the title song and a use of God Is Love that will stay with you long after the film is over. Da Five Bloods also has its own Mr. Senor Daddy Love, a disc jockey Greek chorus represented here by Hanoi Hannah, Van Veronica Ngo. It is she who tells the Bloods about the death of Dr. King, and it is she who taunts them with the question of why they're fighting for a country that will treat them like they're second-class citizens when they return. In a way, it begs the question of what is the true measurement of patriotism and why it is far too often wrapped up in jingoism rather than sacrifice. Lee has crafted an exciting, violent film that can be enjoyed as strictly that, but what elevates it to greatness is what it says and what it shows about the perception of blackness, whether in heroic situations or human ones. It's no mistake that Da Five Bloods ends with Langston Hughes' words. With Da Five Bloods, Spike Lee follows his long-overdue Oscar win for BlacKkKlansman by revealing a side of the Vietnam story that's seldom told. Through the Trojan horse of a treasure hunt adventure movie, the director explores the mindset of black soldiers who fought for their country at a time when African Americans were being oppressed at home. With one foot in the past and the other striding in sync with the Black Lives Matter movement, Lee interweaves potent social critique with escapist B-movie thrills as four veterans return to Nam to claim the loot they were ordered to retrieve decades earlier but stashed for themselves instead. The result is overlong and erratic, but also frequently surprising for a contemporary riff on the classic greed doesn't pay parable, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Entertainment journalists have taken to describing Da Five Bloods as timely because its release coincides with the nationwide protests that spontaneously arose following the murder of George Floyd. That is true, but let's be clear, Lee has always been ahead of his timely. He reminded us of that a week ago with his new Three Brothers video, which identifies the horrifying pattern connecting the murder of Radio Raheem in 1989's Do the Right Thing to the more recent choking deaths of Floyd and Eric Garner. Will history stop repeating itself? The short film implores. And now, Da Five Bloods, which the Cannes Film Festival reportedly intended to screen out of competition, marks another bold salvo from an artist committed to delivering political statements through popular entertainment. In this case, Lee has Netflix behind him, which offers the widest possible exposure for the straight-to-streaming release at a time when movie theaters are just barely beginning to reopen. For better or worse, the project has a distinctive Netflix feel to it as well. a shaggy structure, an unwieldy runtime, and small-screen quality visual effects. The company is committed to enabling auteurs to make their passion projects, granting them greater freedom and resources than the traditional studios do. Directors repeatedly prove to be their own worst enemies when given carte blanche, and Lee occasionally self-sabotages here. The 155-minute film opens strong, addressing the past and present trauma of black GIs before devolving into a series of formulaic standoffs in the back half. Once that happens, even a handful of fully committed performances, most notably from de facto squad leader Delroy Lindo and Chadwick Boseman as the fallen hero they all look up to, can't keep it from becoming the kind of generic pyrotechnic action fodder Hollywood churned out back in the 90s, complete with booby traps and stock double crosses. But Da 5 Bloods is smarter than its Indiana Jones-style set pieces. Lee and BlacKkKlansman collaborator Kevin Willmott took The Last Tour, a spec script by the Rocketeer co-writers Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo, in which a handful of white vets head back to the jungle to retrieve a trunk full of gold, and overhauled the concept to address larger concerns of inequality and discrimination. Da 5 Bloods kicks off with a wrenchingly effective montage. A sacco, 160-second distillation of the heated civil rights battle that raged on the home front while the United States sent those it deemed expendable to fight in a foreign war, featuring stinging sound bites from Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, and Angela Davis, who predicts, if the link-up is not made between what's happening in Vietnam and what's happening here, we may very well face a period of full-blown fascism very soon. Leave it to Lee to begin a heist movie with Black Panther talking points, a signal that this film views race as central to its critique of both the Vietnam War and American culture. Historical context thus established the squad's 4 surviving soldiers: Eddie, Norm Lewis, who played the Phantom of the Opera on Broadway, Melvin, Lee regular Isiah Whitlock Jr., Otis, Clarke Peters of The Wire, and Paul, Lindo, outstanding as the gang's most damaged member, reunite in a posh Ho Chi Minh City hotel. Rather than limiting its critique to the U.S., the movie also confronts racism in contemporary Vietnam, as when Otis goes to visit his wartime flame Tien, Lei Ai Lan, discovering the daughter, Sandy Hung Pham, he didn't know existed, touching on a subject central to the musical Miss Saigon and too few other works. Citing the racial slur locals have hurled at their child all her life, Tien chillingly observes, "The white GI taught us that word." Joined by Paul's son David, Jonathan Majors, the foursome set off for the jungle to the thundering horns of Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, a too obvious reference to that most ambitious of Vietnam movies, Apocalypse Now. It's a point often made that filmmakers need some distance to grapple with such a significant event as war, and Coppola's epic may have followed too closely on the heels of America's failed intervention in Vietnam to grasp some of the finer points that Lee raises here, including the idea that black soldiers often had conflicting opinions about how to respond to their own mistreatment. Lee introduces ill-fated squad leader Stormin' Norman Boseman via flashback scenes in which he appears alongside his 4 comrades. With the exception of one clearly manipulated snapshot at the outset, Da 5 Bloods avoids de-aging the actors as Martin Scorsese's The Irishman did, an unconventional yet effective creative choice that gives these scenes an impressionistic air, suggesting how these men have been reliving these battles regularly in their own heads ever since. Until the CG face replacement technology gets better, this is the right call in this context. Norman unites the Bloods, who fight as a neatly coordinated unit, a band of brothers rather than Rambo-like individuals, and later challenges their anger when Hanoi Hannah delivers the news of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. "We won't let nobody use our rage against us. We control our rage," Norman insists, as the soldiers agree that the gold, recovered from a CIA plane downed en route to paying Lahu allies for information about the Viet Cong, is rightfully theirs. In most treasure movies, avarice is reason enough to drive men to risk their lives. Here, their motives are more engaged, invoking reparations, decades before the concept entered the mainstream. "We was the very first people who died for this red, white, and blue," Norman argues, We've been dying for this country from the very get, hoping one day they'd give us our rightful place." Here, editor Adam Goff cuts to a portrait of Crispus Attucks, shot to death in the Boston Massacre, in an approach determined not to let the film's historical details, deliberately overlooked in so many classrooms, get lost. The movie has a dynamic, self-conscious feel at times, as D.P. Newton Thomas Sigel alternates between stocks and aspect ratios, and characters sing along with Marvin Gaye, several of whose songs are interwoven with Terence Blanchard's emotion-rousing score. It's an engaging approach until, at nearly the midpoint, the men find their buried treasure. Next, honoring a long-ago oath, they turn their attention to locating Norman's remains, which they succeed in doing only moments later. Having achieved these goals so early in the script, the film seems uncertain where to go, beyond the obvious strategy of letting greed divide them. There are other obstacles too, in the form of a foreign landmine removal organization called LAM, similar to the Halo Trust, a shady French fence played by Jean Reno and a group of contemporary Vietnamese soldiers, led by Nguyen Ngoc Lam, all of whom want in on the haul. Apart from LAM volunteers, Simon, Paul Walter Hauser, and Seppo, Jasper Pakkanen, the film's white characters are French, which evokes an earlier chapter of colonial exploitation in the region only tangentially addressed. The film juggles a budding attraction between Paul's son David and LAM leader Hetty Bouvier, Melanie Thierry, that it handles awkwardly, while reducing the locals who claim the gold to sadistic Asian caricatures. Audiences may be accustomed to such stereotypes in brain-dead action movies, but Da Five Bloods is so sophisticated early on that it's disheartening to see it fall back on lazy cliches. Such missteps make it tricky to accept some of Lee's bolder choices in the second half, as when Lindo's MAGA hat-wearing character Paul goes rogue, delivering 2 long monologues directly to the camera. Lindo is dynamite in the role, which, read a certain way, represents an intriguing variation on the usual PTSD tropes. One whose trauma isn't limited to Vietnam, but extends to the racism he has faced on the domestic front as well. Consider the soldiers' original mission, not the scheme that brings them back to Nam now, but the one that sent them into harm's way in the first place. The U.S. government ordered these men to recover millions of dollars in gold bars, fully aware that it might cost them their lives. No wonder Norm concludes that war is money, and money is war. Da Five Bloods confronts where black soldiers fit into this equation. At roughly the same level they did in the American economic system that was built upon their backs. That's a tough lesson echoed by the Black Lives Matter protesters demonstrating off-screen in the streets. Lee anticipated their anger, while restoring overlooked Americans' place in history once again. Even though his critique feels grafted onto this uneven genre outing at times, it's hard to imagine a more resonant movie for this moment. Spike Lee's career can be described as a lover's quarrel with American movies. And with America, too. As he has demonstrated his mastery of established genres, the biopic, the musical, the cop movie, the combat picture, and so on, he has also reinvented them, pointing out blind spots and filling in gaps. His critique of Hollywood's long history of ignoring and distorting black lives has altered the way we look at movies. His attempts to expand the frame and correct the record have changed the course of the cultural mainstream. I'm tempted to say that with Da Five Bloods, which debuts on Netflix on Friday, Lee has done it again. But when has he ever repeated himself? This long, anguished, funny, violent excursion into a hidden chamber of the nation's heart of darkness isn't like anything else, even if it may put you in mind of a lot of other things. In its anger, its humor, and its exuberance, in the emotional richness of the central performances and of Terence Blanchard's score, this is unmistakably a Spike Lee joint. It's also an argument with and through the history of film. In country, again, from left, Jonathan Majors, Isiah Whitlock Jr., Norm Lewis, and Delroy Lindo in Spike Lee's Da Five Bloods. Credit, David Lee, Netflix. The story about the lethal consequences of a search for buried gold is struck from the template of The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. A journey upriver from Ho Chi Minh City into the Vietnamese interior recalls Apocalypse Now, which the characters have all seen. One of them is also a big Rambo fan. And even as it takes up unfinished real-world business at home and in Vietnam, Da 5 Bloods wrestles with some of the defining myths and motifs of American cinema. It's a Western concerned with greed, honor, loyalty, and revenge. It's a bittersweet comedy involving a group of male friends looking back and growing old. It's a platoon picture about a dangerous mission, a father-son melodrama, an adventure story, a caper, and a political provocation. There's more. There's a lot. Double crosses, red herrings, dead certainties, and live landmines. Furious debates about ends and means, money and morality, capitalism and imperialism, Hawaiian print shirts, tropical drinks, OxyContin bottles, and assault weapons. It doesn't always hold together, but it never lets go. As prologue to the main narrative, there is a churning, chronologically disordered montage of images from the 60s and 70s, news clips and photographs that illustrate the fateful convergence of military escalation in Southeast Asia and racial conflict in the United States. Some of the faces and voices are familiar, and the lesson is clear. From every angle, the situation was a mess, a quagmire. For black soldiers like the 5 in the movie's title, it was especially agonizing. They were asked to kill and die in a morally dubious undertaking in the service of a country that refused to treat them as full citizens. North Vietnamese propagandists like Hanoi Hannah, played by Veronica Ngo, didn't hesitate to point this out. When we touch down in the present, we are in a Ho Chi Minh City hotel where the 4 surviving Bloods, Melvin, Isiah Whitlock Jr., Eddie, Norm Lewis, Otis, Clarke Peters, and Paul Delroy Lindo have gathered for what looks like an old-timers reunion tour. Part of the Big Red One, the Army's 1st Infantry Division, the men have come to look for the remains of their squad leader, Storeman Norman, who was killed in a firefight. A deep thinker and a shrewd tactician, Norman has taken on almost mythical grandeur in his comrades' memories. They refer to him as our Malcolm and our Martin. When the borders of the frame narrow and the color balance shifts to signify that we are back in the war, Norman is played by Chadwick Boseman, a casting choice that underlines the heroism of the character, who is stamped with the likeness of Jackie Robinson and T'Challa. The Bloods believe that somewhere in country, along with Norman's bones, lies a strongbox full of gold bars, the property of the U.S. government until Norman and his squad claimed them, either as the spoils of war or as reparations. The 4 veterans have different ideas about what should be done with the loot if they manage to recover it, and they aren't the only interested parties. Tien Luai Lan, Otis's former lover, is part of the scheme in association with an unsavory Frenchman in a white linen suit, Jean Reno. Paul's semi-estranged son, David Jonathan Majors, joins the expedition, which crosses paths with a trio of international NGO workers. Melanie Chieri, Paul Walter Hauser, and Jasper Pakkonen. There's also Vin, Johnny Tri Nguyen, the group's Vietnamese guide, who reminds the visiting Americans that wars never really end. The truth of this observation is borne out in various ways, some of them bluntly literal. Lee, who wrote the script with Danny Bilson, Paul DeMeo, and Kevin Wilmot, doesn't escape from the exoticism that has characterized most American movies about Vietnam, and he doesn't pursue the connections between black power politics and international anti-imperialism as far as he might have. But his strength as a political filmmaker has always resided in his ability to bring contradictions to chaotic life rather than to resolve them in any ideologically coherent proposition. This is the opposite of a shortcoming. It seems safe to say that America itself has never been an ideologically coherent proposition, and its greatest artists embrace havoc as a kind of birthright, producing not analyses of chaos but indelible embodiments of it. Which brings me to Lindo. Da 5 Bloods is full of wonderful performances, and the warm, profane, masculine banter among the Bloods is a response to and a relief from the horror they have shared and still face. They all live with pride and regret, scarred in large and small ways by the trauma they endured as young men. Instead of using digital de-aging or look-alike casting, Lee places Whitlock, Lindo, Peters, and Lewis alongside Boseman in the flashback scenes, which creates a sense of the uncanny immediacy of memory. The living project their present selves back into the past, while the dead never grow old. To describe Paul as haunted would be less an understatement than a category mistake. He is a colossal, terrifying presence, an archetype in the mold of Natty Bumppo, Captain Ahab, Bigger Thomas, and Rambo himself. Lindo's performance, though, is achingly specific, rigorously human-scaled. The storm of rage, guilt, resentment, and self-pity that surges through Paul is traced to various sources, small tragedies that illuminate larger catastrophes. When they first meet up in Ho Chi Minh City, shaking hands and busting chops, the other guys give Paul grief for his red MAGA baseball cap. The hat is almost a character in its own right. "That's right, I voted for him," Paul declares. Everyone knows what Spike Lee thinks of the current president, but everyone should also remember that Lee often shows an almost affectionate interest in characters whose views he finds abhorrent. It's a long list that encompasses John Turturro's Pino in Do the Right Thing and the snarling white supremacist played by Pakonen in BlacKkKlansman. And Lee doesn't treat Paul as a misguided reactionary. His pain is the motor and the moral of the story. He isn't the hero of the movie. He's the reason to see it. Spike Lee has shown up with an insurgent filmic uproar to match the uproar in the world. Da 5 Bloods is a paintball gun loaded with real bullets, a blast of satire and emotional agony about race and the American empire, the evergreen wound of Vietnam, African-American sacrifices on the field of battle, and the fact that black deaths matter. It's an outrageous action painting of a film, splattering moods, genres, ideas, and archive clips all over the screen, with many a Brechtian vaudeville alienation. It feels sometimes like an old-style war movie such as The Dirty Dozen, but maybe Godard's Le Petit Soldat, with playful riffs on Hollywood Vietnam standards and even John Huston's The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. The movie tricks you into thinking that it's going to be a gentle, bittersweet picture about middle-aged guys with giant guts and prostates, sadly coming to terms with their past, and the importance of letting go. And then it detonates a shock of fear and greed, which itself is always verging on action movie melodrama and farce. It's all so inventively bizarre that you could treat it simply as a black comedy, but in the final 15 minutes, there is an amazing crescendo of emotion. The Bloods of the title are Paul, Delroy Lindo, Otis, Clarke Peters, Melvin, Isiah Whitlock Jr., and Eddie, Norm Lewis. 4 aging Vietnam veterans who have returned to Southeast Asia on what appears to be a luxury vacation trip down memory lane. All 4 are haunted by the memory of their squad leader Norman, Chadwick Boseman, who died in action before their eyes and whose memory they have romanticized. Lee creates flashback combat sequences for the 5 men, but without Irishman-type youthification for the 4 survivors. They appear in the past the way they are now, as sweaty, out-of-condition, and very scared old guys in the jungle, surreally led by the impossibly handsome young Boseman, who has grown not old as those that are left grew old. He was and is their leader. Lee shows us that he now looks like their son. And this is especially powerful when they hear about Martin Luther King's assassination from the communist Radio Hanoi announcer, Van Veronica Ngo. And Norman angrily tells his men to ignore her recommendation to mutiny because they owe their racist commanders nothing. Yet the 4 guys' reappearance in Vietnam now is even more complicated. They are convinced they can recover a secret cache of U.S. gold bullion intended to pay South Vietnamese troops, which they found in a burnt-out plane and had to abandon. And Paul, a recent Trump convert in a MAGA cap, finds nothing therapeutic in their journey into the past. He gets more and more disturbed. Lee has taken the battle-scarred old movie trope of Vietnam and found something relevant and intersectionally complex. Black people, because they largely didn't have the contacts or resources to avoid the draft or to finesse the avoidance of dangerous frontline duty, found themselves engaging the enemy and being a major, though underreported, part of the Vietnam story. Paradoxically, it meant taking on oppressed people with whom they had no quarrel. That is, those people that Muhammad Ali famously said had never tainted him with the N-word, but also feeling ambiguous and conflicted about warfare, patriotism, and America itself. They had fought, sacrificed, and felt proud. All of these ideas and feelings swirl around into 5 Bloods, knockabout rhetoric mixed in with grandstanding sentimentality and action, right up to the old-school curtain call credits, like something from The Great Escape. There are some uproarious war movie-type flourishes, including a graphic shot of what happens to a snake when you shoot at it hysterically with your M16 assault rifle. Lee mixes up the tone and mood, and with the knowing cinematic references and consciously contrived scenarios, it's possible to feel detached or amused or bemused. But all that paves the way for the final 10 minutes, in which Lee brings in an outpouring of sadness and grief and determination that is almost overwhelming. For all its craziness, Day 5 Bloods finds an operatic anguish and yearning. Timing is everything. Then again, great filmmaking is great filmmaking no matter the surroundings. But in the case of director Spike Lee's latest, Da 5 Bloods, the film feels so of the moment that you could almost swear he made it yesterday, a quality it shares with his previous feature, the Oscar-winning BlacKkKlansman. The film opens with a quick recap of Black American history in the late 1960s, especially as it applies to the Vietnam War. But it also incorporates major events like the moon landing and various speeches by notable black leaders, many of whom were assassinated or otherwise silenced in that period or shortly thereafter. And then there are the protests. So much footage of protests that it almost seems deliberate. Wouldn't that be amazing? The soundtrack for this few minutes of footage is Marvin Gaye's Inner City Blues, Make Me Wanna Holler, and at a particular point, we clearly hear the lyric, "Trigger happy policing." I don't know if Lee has adjusted anything about this film in the last 2 weeks, but I kind of doubt it. Once again, he proves just how tapped into the sensibility of the times he truly is, and it's chilling. Gaye's music is the primary emotional thread of the film's soundtrack, primarily songs from his landmark 1971 album What's Going On, which never seems to lose its relevance or power no matter what decade we're in. Lee uses a vocal-only performance of the title track quite beautifully in key scenes, and it feels like the characters are entering into a dream they don't necessarily want to be having. The film is set primarily in modern times, as 4 Vietnam veterans return to the place they fought to look for the remains of a fallen 5th member of their tight-knit group. But they're also after a long buried by them crate of gold bars that they discovered in the wreckage of a CIA cargo plane meant to pay off their allies in the country. Their squad leader, Stormin' Norman, Chadwick Boseman, Black Panther, suggests they bury the gold and come back for it when things have cooled down. But then he's killed, and the plan is put off several decades. A Lee favorite, the supercharged Delroy Lindo plays Paul, who has turned fairly right-wing over the years and even spends part of the film wearing a red MAGA hat. He's clearly suffering from a great deal of mental trauma, refusing any kind of help and becoming more and more paranoid as the retrieval mission goes on. His grown son, Jonathan Majors, the last black man in San Francisco, surprises his father and tags along for the journey in an effort to mend severely damaged bridges between them. Also on hand are Otis, another recent Lee regular Clarke Peters, who made most of the arrangements through an old flame in Vietnam. Eddie, Norm Lewis, a self-made man who is struggling financially at the moment and really needs this gold to be found. And Melvin, Isiah Whitlock Jr., a veteran of The Wire like Peters, who seems like the only one without deep issues going into this journey. I'm sure I won't be the only one to come up with this parallel, but Lee essentially sends his characters on their own Heart of Darkness voyage, a scenario underscored by a big Apocalypse Now banner in a bar the team visits on the night before they leave. With every step, each man is pushed a little deeper into their own personal hell, whether it's physical pain. At least one, maybe two of these men could have issues with opioids. At one point, Paul admits that he sees the ghost of Norman every night and has frequent and lengthy conversations with him. If you could bottle whatever is possessing Lindo in this movie, you could sell it as rocket fuel. He's positively crackling on screen, and we're both fascinated by and terrified of his next move. The discovery of the gold and Norman's remains are weirdly simple tasks, but that's probably because they aren't the real purpose of Da 5 Bloods. Things are meant to come easy at first, because what happens in the second half of this very long movie, just over 2.5 hours, is the slow and awful unraveling. They cross paths with a trio of do-gooders attempting to rid the jungle of landmines: French actress Mélanie Thierry, Finnish actor Jasper Pakkanen, and Richard Jewell and Black Klansman star Paul Walter Hauser. So every step they take from that scene forward becomes increasingly tense. Naturally, things don't go well when these two teams meet, as Paul's paranoia kicks into overdrive and he sees the other group as a threat rather than people who could lead them out of the jungle safely. One of the most mind-bending choices Lee makes is to use his middle-aged lead actors in the flashback scenes with Bozeman, which puts something of a spin on anything we see or hear in those moments. Can we trust whoever is having the memory? Are these moments idealized or factual? We're told everyone idolized Norman, so perhaps this portrait is accurate, or they've made him into the true hero of their story because he's the one who didn't make it back. It would likely require repeat viewing of Da 5 Bloods to make these determinations, but the one thing that these scenes do reveal is that these older actors are in better shape than most of us, and are simply playing up any physical limitations that are on display in the more current timeline. If memory serves, the original script by Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo was taken through a fairly radical rewrite by Lee and Kevin Wilmot, Chirac, Black Klansman, and what seems to be added or adjusted is the perspective. The film clearly incorporates the black experience during wartime. Soldiers are promised a degree of freedom or equality if they serve, and when they return, things remain unchanged in their lives. At one point, someone in the cast refers to black soldiers during Vietnam as cannon fodder, sent in ahead of the white troops to be shot at and reveal the enemy's position. Strangely enough, in the film's final few big sequences, it begins to show signs of being a fairly conventional action movie. But even then, Lee has done such impressive work getting us to care so much about these lost souls that the life or death stakes seem so much higher. The commentary on history is not only rampant, but it seems strangely, disappointingly timeless, as the criticism of Nixon fits comfortably next to statements about our current leadership. Da 5 Bloods makes it crystal clear that the horrors of war aren't just about dying. Those who are dead don't have to remember the way the living do. It's difficult to imagine a film better suited for this very day than this one. With the release of Spike Lee's latest joint Da 5 Bloods out now, it made me realize I haven't watched a ton of his movies. But this would change, since I think it's possible to watch those that have been attached to him and cautious about the ones that haven't gotten the best reputation. This was his follow-up to one of my favorite movies of 2018, Black Klansman, which finally won him an Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay. And he can do anything at this point, when he's here to make films that are not only powerful, but gets us talking about certain issues in the current world today. What's the story? The story of 4 African-American vets, Paul Delroy Lindo, Otis Clarke Peters, Eddie Norm Lewis, and Melvin Isiah Whitlock Jr., who returned to Vietnam. Searching for the remains of their fallen squad leader Stormin' Norman, Chadwick Boseman, and the promise of buried treasure, our heroes, joined by Paul's concerned son David, Jonathan Majors, battle forces of man and nature while confronted by the lasting ravages of the immorality of the Vietnam War. Da 5 Bloods being released on Netflix right now, whereas the year is truly turning into an absolute disaster, the world is being on fire after the death of George Floyd, and riots are happening around the world, waiting for change to happen where we shouldn't be afraid. Believe me, being in a world where I have to be terrified about getting killed for doing nothing wrong is understandable. The tension has been real. With Lee's new joint coming out, I completely forgot about it until the trailer was online a month ago, and I was anticipating what he was going to bring to Netflix, wondering if this move was the right call for him. This would be his second attempt at a war film with black soldiers, since nobody remembers Miracle at St. Anna a decade later. What I can say about his recent film is this is worth remembering for a while. Lee does an excellent job with his directing in what should be called one of his best endeavors yet. It's a different experience than his previous film, but being hooked is what needs to be acquired to enjoy it. The way he was shooting everything was nothing like watching a drama that's part drama, part heist, from what I assumed it would be, but better. As much as Lee's directing is great, it couldn't have been done without one of the best screenplays this year so far. As writers Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo, the Rocketeer, Lee and his BlacKkKlansman co-writer Kevin Wilmot wrote a drama not only unpredictable, but made it feel like it was based on a non-fiction novel or something that happened in the history books. It's an original story, and I wouldn't even know. From what I was watching, I couldn't help but think of this as Stand By Me, Three Kings, and Platoon all rolled into one. The first half is mostly just build up with a lot of scenes of characters talking with a few flashbacks to get us to understand what's coming ahead. It's understandable most saying it gets a bit to get going when it's the right amount of time to get attached to these people. Being that it's 156 minutes, most of Lee's movies are longer than expected. Once it steps into the second half of them in the present, it gets a lot stronger, and where there's no way of losing your attention at that point. It's another film this weekend where it's well-paced without being annoyed by how long it's going, because I was still invested with how the story ends. The best compliment I can say about the performances from everyone here is even though I might have not been familiar with most of the actors here, you honestly believe these are real people on this journey together. You easily buy into their friendship when they first meet up again and believe they are war buddies for life. But who was the one you can't take your eyes off of? That would be Delroy Lindo as Paul, who outshined everybody in his sight. He has worked with Lee a few times in the past, and he was the most recognizable of our main characters. There hasn't been a ton of performances this year I believe are worth being talked about for an Oscar, but believe all the hype around Lindo's role because I was blown away by how great he was for a role that relied on him to bring out anything emotional hidden inside out we don't know yet as a man who's suffering from PTSD. Look out for a moment where he's talking to himself in the third person, breaking the fourth wall I didn't see coming. The other standout was Jonathan Majors as his son David, and if you haven't seen the underrated The Last Black Man in San Francisco, he is a performer I've been monitoring ever since, and he carried his own with his performance, showing he's one exceptional performer on screen. The rest of the supporting cast was good, though I kind of expected a little more from them, which includes Melanie Thierry, Paul Walter Hauser, and Jasper Pakonen as a group of people who defuses landmines. There was a scene between Thierry's Hetty and Major's David early on that was enjoyable, and there isn't a lot of Bozeman as Stormin' Norman since he's only in the flashback sequences. You won't be expecting a ton of action, even though it's a war drama, but when there is, it's what you would expect with the firefights of Vietnam that felt like you're fighting alongside the Bloods. An element that took me was how intense it turned out to be. Spoiling nothing, there's something that happened around the middle, and your heart is pounding due to figuring out how this certain situation would be solved. Da 5 Bloods, 2020. In going into the technical aspect, Newton Thomas Sigel, Drive Bohemian Rhapsody, cinematography was incredible to look at when the landscape of Thailand and Vietnam. If you remember the trailer and saw that the visual style of 3 different aspect ratios is used here, it drives the film along and feel immersed enough, where it's a wide 2:39:1 in the present, a boxed 1.33.1/16mm during the Vietnam flashbacks, and a 16:9 when they venture in the jungle to search for the gold. A part of me was thinking it was going to be pointless when I was in the trailer, but it's a technique used really well in here without being distracting. And it ain't a Spike Lee film without an amazing score from Terrence Blanchard that's worth listening to again. A frequent collaborator with the direction, he delivers another score that settles into a scene without becoming overbearing. Does it also include the typical dolly zooms? You bet. As for problems I had with the film, the long runtime didn't bother me as it went on, But there would be no harm in shaving about 15 minutes off when a couple of scenes might have been a tad too long. And whenever it cuts back to when the characters were fighting in Vietnam, I was confused as to why they didn't get younger actors to portray the four men, nor uses de-aging effects on them. Who knows? It might not be an issue for someone when viewing this. Let's be honest about ourselves. The Vietnam War didn't do too well for anyone who has fought in it, and that goes especially for black soldiers. What's the point of fighting when they get nothing in return, and all they get is to be killed or be discriminated against? Why do our duty when most didn't want to in the first place? The reason these four returned to bring those gold bars back is to pay back those who lost during the war. After watching this, I never knew about this, and it made me anger why America can't live through peace without those being idiots. Like our pivotal characters, even though the war is over, it can never be forgotten for anyone who fought in one, either reality or mentality. This was made as a response to what's going on in the world, which Lee does when you look at his filmography about tackling race. But here's another example when thinking out what he's saying about society in the past and right now. I didn't know what to expect from Da 5 Bloods, and I really dug it to say it's worth watching, along with the excellent black movies currently available on Netflix. It's overlong for sure, but Lee's latest joint happens to be his most mature effort, with his beautiful direction, great ensemble, especially an Oscar-worthy performance from Lindo, and a captivating story that could have been true, for all I know. The movie, Moving Through. Its 157-minute runtime. Cinematographer Newton Thomas Seagull handles it well, shooting some extraordinarily gorgeous and horrific images while fiddling with the aspect ratio in ways I found too clever to be annoyed with. One change occurs during an old-fashioned wipe, while another manifests itself with a dramatic opening of the screen. If Seagull is the MVP of the imagery, Terran. Blanchard and Marvin Gaye rule the soundtrack. Blanchard's score is bombastic, terrifying and militaristic 1 minute, achingly beautiful the next. And Lee's use of Gaye songs, primarily from the What's Going On album, is aces, especially in a chilling a cappella rendering of the title song, and a use of God is Love that will stay with you long after the film is over. The 5 Bloods also has its own Mr. Sayer Daddy Love a Disc Jockey Greek chorus, represented here by Hanoi Hannah. Van Veronica, no. It is she who tells the Bloods about the death of Dr. King, and it is she who taunts them with the question of why they're fighting for a country that will treat them like they're second-class citizens when they return in a way. It begs the question of what is the true measurement of patriotism, and why it is far too often wrapped up in jingoism rather than sacrifice. Lee has crafted an exciting violent film that can be enjoyed as strictly that, but what elevates it to greatness is what it says and what it shows about the perception of blackness. Whether in heroic situations or human ones, it feels both reductive and redundant to refer to a LeJoint as timely. But his latest will feel this way to many. The 5 Bloods recaps a long history of state-sponsored murder and abuse of black people and suppression of protests, just like those against the recent police murders of George Floyd, Banna Taylor, Tony McDade, and so many more. But this film is also a conversation about American imperialism, weaving a connective thread between the crimes of law enforcement on home soil and the disproportionate conscription of black people, as well as horrifying atrocities committed by U.S. soldiers abroad. This already threatens to make the film sound like a debilitating affair, but it's far from it. If anything, it's often quite funny, with plenty of colorful banter to go around. The eponymous Bloods are military veterans of different social strata and political alignment who have returned to Vietnam to pay final respects to the leader of their unit. Storm and Norman Chadwick Boseman in flashback with regal charisma and get rich by finding Mia Gold. While doing so, as tensions rise between the old war, Buddy's Lee creates more thorny, complex morality than in his other recent films. These characters were conscripted and exploited, but were still part of an invading force characters and viewers. alike are confronted by acts perpet, traded by American infantry as horrific images of war crimes linger on screen, daring you to look away. Paul Delroy Lindo, instilling the character with paranoid delirium in particular, spouts hateful slurs and holds on to a misguided xenophobic patriotism, buying into rhetoric that helps justify the horrors of his past, bringing out the tension between him and his son David Jonathan Majors, the standout of the last black man in San Francisco, as the latter struggles with his ties to this traumatized but prejudiced man. There's a fascinating direct dialogue with Apocalypse Now, with visual nods and similar story beats throughout announced. From the moment K's film's title card looms over a DJ set in a Vietnamese bar. Only here, Colonel CTS is a guy wearing a MAGA hat, a blend of road trip treasure, hunt, and war movie. It's a tough balancing act, and that first hour can feel as though it's missing the dynamism and color of Lee's exploration of urban spaces as he leaves behind his comfort zone for wide-open rice paddies, rivers, and dense jungle. But the madness that follows is worth the wait, as the quest for gold spirals bloodily out of control. Newton Thomas Seagull's camera work shifts back and forth between different aspect ratios and color grading as Lee navigates different time periods. The lensing eventually becomes more familiar, with Lee's confrontational direct-to camera monologues emerging as time passes and end anger builds. It's all backed by a typically rousing score from longtime collaborator Terrence Blanchard, accompanied by songs from Marvin Gaye. What's Going On album sometimes, employing gay naked vocal that are used sparingly and very effectively. The usual caveats of late-era Lee Apply the Five Bloods is almost overloaded with ideas, leaving room for only very thinly sketched female characters. The paternity of the daughter of a Vietnamese sex worker is touched on, but never from her perspective. French landmine disposal. Expert H. Melanie Terry appears as a fascinating riff on the plantation owners from the Redux cut of Apocalypse Now, but her arc fizzles out. Black women still remain at the sidelines. This has been a fairly consistent element of Lee's work and continues to disappoint. At least Hanoi Hannah, A Real Radio personality played with Major Cool by Veronica No is given some room to stand out, some of the film's most striking moments are hers as she broadcasts to Black American soldiers calmly smoking, as she questions fighting for a country that kills and oppresses them, meant to discourage American GIS. Her words sound more like solidarity when directed at black soldiers. It's also here that Lee's long-standing use of archive footage to reinforce dialogue proves most powerful between his multiple jabs at Trump. The Klansman in the Oval Office, Lee shows how the history of film ties into America's imperialism, as well as fundamental anti-blackness. The Five Bloods doesn't pretend to tell a complete history of cinema's relationship with the war here, mostly, and rightly referred to as the American War, so much as it works to reevaluate stale narratives and highlight those that remain untold. This is, of course, still an American film set in Vietnam, but it's one that tells the story from a viewpoint too often minimized. Other information about this film throughout the year, I keep a document listing every film I make. See, I do this mostly as a refresher for when I make my end-of-year lists and the Oscar predictions, since some films may have been amazing, but because my memory is so iffy, sometimes I may not think about it right off the bat. I also keep a second list potential best and worst list. So if something stands out as particularly good or particularly bad, then I won't forget it when the time comes to make those lists. By June of last year, I had a top 10 best list. I could have posted and still had to make some really painful cuts this year. I barely have a top 5. I feel that confident about. That's how empty this year has felt. You can undoubtedly blame most of this on the current plague we're experiencing that has pushed so many films back over a year and only left us with streaming films add to that. The general rule that the prestige films tend to wait until around the time the Oscar nominations are being sorted out. And it's been a slow year, and someone needed to throw something out to fill the void. Enter Leah LeJoint is almost guaranteed to be a bright spot in a year of film, and A Five Bloods is no exception. Set in Vietnam, the movie tells the story of a group of soldiers from the 1st Infantry Division who named themselves Bloods when they were fighting the war in Vietnam. They had the job of securing a pile of gold bars that were to be delivered to that L people. But instead, they buried it and are now back there to not only retrieve the gold, but also the remains of one of their fallen brothers throughout the film. We watch as this group slowly explores a place they only remember from combat and see this once tight-knit group slowly tear themselves apart in their quest as an ensemble piece. This film starts slow and grows into something genuinely special, relegating most of the actual war footage to flashbacks shot with Vietnam War appropriate film. A nice touch. Most of it is just watching this group of friends slowly tear themselves apart due to greed, paranoia, or secrets that they've been holding on to since the days of Vietnam. Each of the bloods that make up the core of the movie bounce off each other so well and provide us with genuinely great moments, aided by stellar performances by an ensemble that makes every scene an utter delight. You know, your main cast is special when the Black Panther is the least important character. Yeah, the trailer might have done a touch of lying by selling the film on scenes with Chadwick Boseman when he's probably in the film the least out of everyone. But when he's the one who stands out the least, then that tells you how great the main cast actually are. Every one of you. Our ensemble gets a great moment from Norm Lewis, Eddie, trying to talk everyone into donating their newfound riches to good causes, to Isiah Witch Rock Jr.'s Melvin, excitedly searching for treasure, to Clarke, Peter's Otis having to deal with learning about a child he fathered during the war. All of them are incredible and worthy of high praise. But the film itself just belongs to Delroy Lindo as Paul in a role that is just the meest thing I've ever seen. A Trump, supporting paranoid who is trying to work on his relationship with his son, who he's dragged along on this quest. He is really the driving force of most of the conflict and has several scenes that could best be described as his inevitable Oscar clip. He manages to make you go between hating him, then rooting for him, and then back to hating him, all within the course of a single scene. This isn't to say the film is perfect. It's not. It takes a while to really get going, and the pacing at points feels a little off, to the point where I found myself almost losing interest until Delroy Lindo would do something else to grab my attention again. At 2.5 hours, it's ambitious as hell, but I could see them tightening it up a little and making the film flow better. Part of this could just be that Spike Lee's last film, Black KK Klansman, spoiled me by being one of the best films of that year, and with a bar that HID's hard to match it. But there are enough things about this film that don't quite work, mostly a pacing thing for the first chunk of the film, that it doesn't quite feel as good as the last thing Spike made, even though it's still really good. The Five Hoods is another of those Spike Lee joints that will entertain you but will also make you think, throwing out little nudges at the events of today as only Spike can do, with at least one performance that we will probably be talking about a year from now and some genuinely great cinematography. It's another genuinely great movie that's put a big smile on my face, if for no other reason than I can actually say I saw a really good movie. Again, something I don't feel like I've been able to say that often. This year, with Five Bloods, Spike Lee follows his long overdue Oscar win for Black KK Klansman by revealing a side of the Vietnam story that's seldom told through. The Trojan horse of a treasure hunt. Adventure movie. The director explores the mindset of black soldiers who fought for their country at a time when African Americans were being oppressed at home with one foot in the past and the other striding in sync with the Black Lives Matter movement. Lee interweaves potent social critique with escapist bovie thrills as 4 veterans return to N to claim the loot they were ordered to retrieve decades earlier but stash for themselves instead. The result is overlong and erratic, but also frequently surprising for a contemporary. Riff on the classic greed doesn't pay. Parable The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Entertainment journalists have taken to describing Deaf Five Bloods as timely, because its release coincides with the nationwide protests that spontaneously arose following the murder of George Floyd. That is true, but let's be clear, Lee has always been ahead of his timely. He reminded us of that a week ago with his new Three Brothers video, which identifies the horrifying pattern connecting the murder of Radio Raheem in 1989's Do the Right Thing to the more recent choking deaths of Floyd and Eric Arner. Will history stop repeating itself? The short film implores. And now The Five Bloods, which the Cannes Film Festival reportedly intended to screen out of competition, marks another bold salvo from an artist committed to delivering political statements through popular entertainment. In this case, Lee has Netflix behind him, which offers the widest possible exposure for the straight-to-streaming release at a time when movie theaters are just barely beginning to reopen. For better or worse, the project has a distinctive Netflix feel to it as well. Shaggy structure and unwieldy runtime and small screen quality visual effects. The company is committed to enabling oars to make their passion projects, granting them greater freedom and resources than the traditional studios. Do directors repeatedly prove to be their own worst enemies when given carte blanche, and Lee occasionally self-sabotages here. The 155-minute film up strong, addressing the past and present trauma of Black GIS before devolving into a series of Formula EX standoffs in the back half. Once that happens, even a handful of fully committed performances, most notably from DAO squad leader Delroy Lindo and Chadwick Boseman as the fallen hero they all look up to, can't keep it from becoming the kind of generic pyrotechnic action FOD Hollywood churned out back in the 90s, complete with booby traps and stock double crosses. But The Five Bloods is smarter than its Indiana Jones-style set pieces Lee and Black KK. Klansman collaborator Kevin Wilmot took the last tour, a spec script by the Rocketeer co-writers Danny Bills and Paul Deo, in which a handful of white vets head back to the jungle to retrieve a trunk full of gold, and overhauled the concept to address larger concerns of inequality and discrimination. The Five Bloods kicks off with a wrenchingly effective montage, ACO 1602 distillation, of the heated civil rights battle that raged on the home front while the United States sent those it deemed expendable to fight in a foreign war, featuring stinging soundbites from Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, and Angela Davis, who predicts, if the link-up is not made between what's happening in Vietnam and what's happening here, we may very well face a period of full-blown fascism. Very soon, leave it to Lee to begin a heist movie with Black Panther. Talking points a signal that this film views race as central to its critique of both the Vietnam War and American culture. Historical context thus established the squad's 4 surviving soldiers. Eddie, Norm Lewis, who played the Phantom of the Opera on Broadway, Melvin Lee regular Isiah Whitlock Jr., Otis Clarke Peters of The Wire, and Paul Lindo outstanding as the gang's most damaged member reunite in a posh Hoi Minh City hotel rather than limiting its critique to the U.S. The movie also confronts racism in contemporary Vietnam, as when Otis goes to visit his wartime flame team Lean, discovering the daughter Sandy Hung Pham he didn't know existed, touching on a subject central to the musical Miss Saigon and too few other works citing the racial slur locals have hurled at their child all her life. Tin chillingly observes the white GI taught us that word, joined by Paul's son David Jonathan Majors. The foursome set off for the jungle to the thundering horns of Wagner. Ride of the Valkyries, a too obvious reference to that most ambitious of Vietnam movies, Apocalypse Now. It's a point often made that filmmakers need some distance to grapple with such a significant event as war, and Kay's epic may have followed too closely on the heels of America's failed intervention in Vietnam to grasp some of the finer points that Lee raises here. including the idea that black soldiers often had conflicting opinions about how to respond to their own mistreatment. Lee introduces ill-fated squad leader Storeman Norman Bosman via flashback. Scenes in which he appears alongside his 4 comrades, with the exception of one clearly manipulated snapshot at the outset. Def 5 Bloods avoids staging the actors as Martin Scorsese the Irishman did an unconventional yet effective creative choice that gives these scenes an impressionistic air, suggesting how these men have been reliving these battles regularly in their own heads ever since, until the CG face replacement technology gets better. This is the right call in this context. Norman unites the Bloods who fight as a neatly coordinated Unit A band of brothers rather than Rambo-like individuals, and later challenges their anger when Hanoi Hannah delivers the news of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. We won't let nobody use our rage against us. We control our rage, Norman insists, as the soldiers agree that the gold recovered from a CIA plane down en route to paying Lahu allies for information about the Viet Cong is rightfully theirs. In most treasure movies, avarice is reason enough to drive men to risk their lives here. Their motives are more engaged, invoking reparations decades before the concept entered the mainstream. We was the very first people who died for this. Red, white, and blue. Norman argues we've been dying for this country from the very get, hoping one day they'd give us our rightful place here. Editor Adam Goff. Cuts to a portrait of Chris, Baddox shot to death in the Boston Massacre, in an approach determined not to let the film's historical details deliberately overlooked in so many classrooms get lost. The movie has a dynamic, self-conscious feel at times, as D.P. Newton-Thomas Seagull alternates between stocks and aspect ratios and characters. Sing along with Marvin Gaye, several of whose songs are interwoven with Terence Blanchard's emotion-rousing score. It's an engaging approach, until at nearly the midpoint, the men find their buried treasure, next honoring a long-ago oath. They turn their attention to locating Norman's remains, which they succeed in doing only moments later, having achieved these goals so early in the script. The film seems uncertain where to go beyond the obvious strategy of letting greed divide them. There are other obstacles too, in the form of a foreign landmine removal organization called LAM, similar to the Halo Trust, a shady French fence played by G. Reno, and a group of contemporary Vietnamese soldiers, LED by Knock Lam, all of whom want in on the haul apart from Lam volunteers Simon, Paul Walter Hauer, and Sippo Jasper Pinon. The film's white characters are French, which evokes an earlier chapter of colonial exploitation in the region, only tangentially address the film juggles. A budding attraction between Paul's son David and Lam leader Bouvier Melanie Tyree that it handles awkwardly, while reducing the locals who claim the gold to sadistic Asian caricatures. Audiences may be accustomed to such stereotypes in brain-dead action movies, but Def 5 Blood is so sophisticated early on that it's disheartening to see it fall back on lazy cliches. Such missteps make it tricky to accept some of Lee's bolder choices in the second half, as when Lindo's MAGA hat-wearing character Paul goes rogue, delivering 2 long monologues directly to the camera. Lindo is dynamite in the role, which, read a certain way, represents an intriguing variation on the usual PTSD tropes, one whose trauma isn't limited to Vietnam, but extends to the racist he has faced on the domestic front as well. Consider the Salders' original mission, not the scheme that brings them back to Nam now, but the one that sent them into harm's way in the first place. The U.S. government ordered these men to recover millions of dollars in gold bars, fully aware that it might cost them their lives. No wonder Norm concludes that war is money, and money is war. The 5 Bloods confronts where black soldiers fit into this equation at roughly the same level they did in the American economic system that was built upon their backs. That's a tough lesson, echoed by the Black Lives Matter protesters demonstrating off-screen in the streets. Lee anticipated their anger while restoring overlooked Americans. place in history once again, even though his critique feels grafted onto this uneven genre outing. At times, it's hard to imagine a more resonant movie for this moment. More detail, watching a movie is a bit like being hit by a wall of information. Should such a thing exist outside the realm of metaphor, some of it sticks, some of it continues on its way toward its next opportunity to do so. Some of it will never stick. This disjointed quality is present even in his best films, when the films are more good than great. There's more stray information searching for a home, though the experience overall is still intellectually and artistically gratifying. This is the case with Deaf Five Bloods, a contemplation of the African-American experience in the Vietnam War, which certainly feels timely given the metaphorical war in the streets of America today. Then again, the sad truth about Lee's films is that they feel timely whenever they come out, as the racial disharmony he examines is a constant undercurrent in American society over the course of 155 minutes. Lee's first feature film for Netflix looks at a number of legacies related to America's intervention in the fight between North and South that tore apart Vietnam in the 1960s and 1970s. The conflict sent more than 58,000 American soldiers to their graves, and possibly as many as 3 million Vietnamese. One is the legacy America left on the country, as scenes set in present day depict the bitterness some locals still feel toward American tourists. But then there is the legacy on African Americans, who comprise just 11% of the U.S. population, but 32% of the boots on the ground in that war. Why, Lee justly wonders, did they do a disproportionate amount of the fighting and dying when their country was reluctant to extend them even the most basic civil rights, which the vast majority of their fellow citizens fully enjoyed? The story is told through the eyes of 4 African-American veterans returning to the country for the first time in the 45 years since they left the Fifth Blood, referenced in the title, whom they called Stormin. Norman Chadwick Boseman didn't leave with them. He was killed in action, and his body was never recovered. Finding his bones and returning them to the family is one motivation behind their return to the jungles that left them so traumatized. The less benevolent goal is to find a chest of gold bars they uncovered in combat and then buried, whose location wasn't previously discoverable after the area was stripped of its vegetation by napalm. Now a mudslide appears to have revealed the location of the downed helicopter that served as another marker for their treasure. So Otis Clarke, Peters, Melvin, Isiah Whitlock Jr., Eddie Norm Lewis, and Paul Delroy Lindo, and crashing the party. Paul's son, David Jonathan Majors, returned to try to find their booty, being posthumously guarded by their fallen fellow blood, like a skeletal pirate of Urde-Liaz, with a shady Frenchman, Jean Reno, and a helpful local guide, John Ingwin, to navigate and try to do right by their friend, as well as reap the reparations for centuries of thankless service rendered to white Americans. Thematically, The Five Bloods is reminiscent of, well, every film Lee has ever made. More specifically, it recalls his 2008 critical misfire, The Miracle at St. Anna, which also followed 4 African-American soldiers stranded behind enemy lines that time during the World War II. So he's followed his most critically acclaimed movie of the 21st century, Black KK Klansman, with a reinterpretation of his least, of course, more than an attempt to get it right this time. It's probably an indication that these thoughts on the experience of being a person of color during wartime are still speaking to him. There's even a bit of David O. Russell's 1999 Triumph, Three Kings, in the idea of soldiers trying to escape with a bounty of gold bars. And the similarity extends even to the title formally. This is Lee's wall of information approach in full effect. The Five Bloods begins with a melange of challenging images from the late 1960s and early 1970s, set to a solemn Terran Blanchard score, which continues a long-time partnership of more than a dozen Lee films. These images are everything from the incident at Kent State University where student protesters were killed, to images of dead Vietnamese babies to the racial unrest from that period. Lee is nothing if not confrontational. He's experimenting formally here, as well as he changes the aspect ratio of the picture from widescreen for the modern-day scenes to the more square appearance of his flashbacks to the war. The fact that the cast play themselves 4.5 decades earlier is an indication that emotional realism is more important to Lee than other forms. The film was shot on location in Vietnam and Thailand, as indicated earlier. Not everything Lee throws at us works. That there are 4 main characters gives us a chance to explore a number of different channels of how these men's lives went since the war, whether impacted by their racial identities or not, though that also has the effect of making the focus more diffuse. Nor should we expect all of these characters to be mouthpieces for Lee, as Paul wears a MAGA hat and admits he voted for Trump, whom Otis refers to as President Fake Bone Spurs, because it's 2.5 hours long and contains multiple points of entry to 5 Bloods. Can be a confounding watch, but it's never less than fully engaging, and in fact, the time passes faster than it might. Lee assembled a cast of age-appropriate actors who are a mixture of Lee veterans, Lindo, Peters, and Whitlock, and those appearing in their first Lee joint Lewis and Majors regular. Collaborator Samuel L. Jackson would have also been age-appropriate, but best not to dwell on what he might have brought to this film. Their chemistry as old friends is authentic and joyous, especially during one sequence where Lee's camera backs up as it captures the 4 of them grooving forward, dancing their own individual dances to the Marvin Gaye record playing at a Saigon dance club called Apocalypse Now. Truth be told, it doesn't really matter if Lee's thoughts are all fully formed or whether he might have extracted some side material if he weren't given the creative latitude afforded by Netflix. Every sequence he mounts has some value to it, and some are downright profound, as has been his custom pretty much throughout his career. Even in his historical films, Lee finds a way for this themes to come crashing into the present tense. He's done so here by finishing on footage of Black Lives Matter organizers, as the whole world considers the #BLM truism right now. Lee makes it easy for us to understand why the lives of these particular black soldiers mattered. Timing is everything. Then again, great filmmaking is great filmmaking no matter the surroundings. But in the case of director Lee's latest to 5 Bloods, the film feels so of the moment that you could almost swear he made it yesterday, a quality it shares with his previous feature, the Oscar-winning Black KK Klansman. The film opens with a quick recap of Black American history in the late 1960s, especially as it applies to the Vietnam War, but it also incorporates major events like the moon landing and various speeches by notable black leaders, many of whom were assassinated or otherwise silenced in that period or shortly thereafter. And then there are the protests. So much footage of protests that it almost seems deliberate. Wouldn't that be amazing? The soundtrack for this few minutes of footage is Marvin Gaye. Inner City Blues make me want to holler, and at a particular point we clearly hear the lyric, trigger-happy, policing eye. Don't know if Lee has adjusted anything about this film in the last 2 weeks, but I kind of doubt it. Once again, he proves just how tapped into the sensibility of the times he truly is, and it's chilling. Gaye's music is the primary emotional thread of the film's soundtrack, primarily songs from his landmark 1971 album, What's Going On, which never seems to lose its relevance or power, no matter what decade we're in. Lee uses a vocal-only performance of the title track quite beautifully in key scenes, and it feels like the characters are entering into a dream they don't necessarily want to be having. The film is set primarily in modern times as 4 Vietnam veterans return to the place they fought to look for the remains of a fallen 5th member of their tight-knit group. But they're also after a long buried by them crate of gold bars that they discovered in the wreckage of a CIA cargo plane meant to pay off their allies in the country. Their squad leader, Stormin' Norman Chadwick Boseman, Black Panther, suggest. They bury the gold and come back for it when things have cooled down, but then he's killed, and the plan is put off. Several decades. A LaFavorite, the supercharged Delroy Lindo, plays Paul, who has turned fairly right-wing over the years, and even spends part of the film wearing a red MAGA hat. He's clearly suffering from a great deal of Al trauma, refusing any kind of help, and becoming more and more paranoid as the retrieval mission goes on. His grown son, Jonathan Majors, the last black man in Sandak. Francisco surprises his father and tags along for the journey in an effort to mend severely damaged bridges between them. Also on hand are Otis, another recently regular Clarke Peters, who made most of the arrangements through an old flame in Vietnam. Eddie Norm Lewis, a self-made man who is struggling financially at the moment and really needs this gold to be found. And Melvin Isiah Whitlock Jr., a veteran of The Wire. Like Peters, who seems like the only one without deep issues going into this journey, I'm sure I won't be the only one to come up with this parallel, but Lee essentially sends his characters on their own Heart of Darkness voyage. A scenario underscored by a big Apocalypse Now banner in a bar the team visits on the night before they leave. With every step, each man is pushed a little deeper into their own personal hell, whether it's physical pain. At least one, maybe two of these men could have issues with opioids at one point. Paul admits that he sees the ghost of Norman every night and has frequent and lengthy conversations with him. If you could bottle whatever is possessing Lindo in this movie, you could sell it as rocket fuel. He's positively crackling on screen, and we're both fascinated by and terrified of his next move. The discovery of the gold and Norman's remains are weirdly simple tasks, but that's probably because they aren't the real purpose of Def 5. Bloods. Things are meant to come easy at first, because what happens in the second half of this very long movie, just over 2.5 hours, is the slow and awful unraveling. They cross paths with a trio of do-gooders attempting to rid the jungle of landmines. French actress Melanie Thierry, Finnish actor Jasper Peenan, and Richard Jewell and Black K-Klansman star Paul Walter House. So every step they take from that scene forward becomes increasingly tense. Naturally, things don't go well when these two teams meet, as Paul's paranoia kicks into overdrive, and he sees the other group as a threat rather than people who could lead them out of the jungle safely. One of the most mind-bending choices Lee makes is to use his middle-aged lead actors in the Niet flashback scenes with Bosman, which puts something of a spin on anything we see or hear in those moments. Can we trust whoever's having the memory? Are these moments idealized or factual, we're told? Everyone idolized Norman, so perhaps this portrait is accurate, or they've made him into the true hero of their story. Because he's the one who didn't make it back, it would likely require repeat viewing of the 5 Bloods to make these determinations. But the one thing that these scenes do reveal is that these older actors are in better shape than most of us, and are simply playing up any physical limitations that are on display in the more current timeline. If memory serves, the original script by Danny Bilson and Paul Deo was taken through a fairly radical rewrite by Lee and Kevin Wilmot, Chirac Black KK-Klansman, and what seems to be added or adjusted is the perspective the film clearly incorporates. The black experience during wartime, soldiers are promised a degree of freedom or equality if they serve, and when they return, things remain unchanged in their lives. At one point, someone in the cast refers to black soldiers during Vietnam as cannon fodder sent in ahead of the white troops to be shot at, and reveal the enemy's POS position. Strangely enough, in the film's final few big sequences, it begins to show signs of being a fairly conventional action movie. But even then, Lee has done such impressive work getting us to care so much about these lost souls that the life or death stakes seem so much higher. The commentary on history is not only rampant, but it seems strangely, disappointingly timeless, as the criticism of Nixon fits comfortably next to statements about our current leadership to 5 Bloods. Makes it crystal clear that the horrors of war aren't just about dying those who are. Dead don't have to remember the way the living do. It's difficult to imagine a film better suited for this very day. Then this one extra information whenever I watch a Lee film, I get the sense that he directs movies, the way Charles Foster Kane manages newspapers. I don't know how to run a newspaper. I just try everything I can think of. I don't mean that to be sned or suggest Spike Lee doesn't know what he's doing. He's by all counts one of the greatest living filmmakers. I just mean to say his work can be quite experimental. His filmmaking philosophy is everything, and the kitchen sink. He makes tons of weird experimental dramas and adaptations that go all in on digressions, tangents, distracting editing, cues fitting strange objects and pieces of artwork in the frame, and cutting to random movies or objects to emphasize a point. Maybe no film is a better example of this than Chero, where he adapted the ancient Greek comedy Lystrata about women committing to a sex strike to end a war into a modern-day morality play about how toxic masculinity is. Contributing to problems in inner-city black communities like Chicago's South Side. It wasn't a terribly good movie, but you can definitely see Lee's vision and the message he wants to discuss loud and clear. He wants his audience to mull over the connection between sex and violence and how communities with heightened occurrences of criminality need to address male violence before social reforms can make a difference. Following the immense success of his critically acclaimed Oscar-winning comedy, Black KK Klansman, his newest film for Netflix, has certainly earned a lot of eyes in its direction. The Five Bloods is a movie that feels like a very natural extension of his voice and the kinds of stories he likes to tell. It's a Vietnam War movie. I get the sense the movie is something of a reversion to Spike Lee's experimental tendencies. Black KK Klansman was produced by Jordan Peele, and I imagine his influence helped focus the project into something more traditional and sellable to traditional movie audiences. Without that focus, Spike Lee's recent movies have been rambling and inconsistent, and I was afraid going into this that it would be a massive step back for him as a director. My concerns weren't relieved when the film started with a slideshow contrasting black activists and speeches in the 1970s with images of American war crimes during the Vietnam War. Spike Lee movies at their weakest are mere lists punctuated by moments of brutality. My concerns, however, cleared as the film's prologue gave way to its introduction of the five lead characters set in modern-day Vietnam. Five black veterans are shown reuniting. For the first time in years, during the war, the group discovered a case full of gold and decided to hide it from the army and come back for it later. Now, as older men, they believe they found the place they hid it before and make an excursion into the jungle to retrieve the treasure they believe is rightfully theirs to Five Bloods is a movie that wears its influences on its sleeve. Its music and dialogue call attention to numerous Vietnam movies that came before it, including Apocalypse Now and Rambo. Given its topicality, it's strange to think this is Lee's first delve into the topic of the Vietnam War before now. That said, it's a natural fit. For him, the dialogue is exactly as tangential and excessive as I expected. Brief tangents are dedicated to every topic, from the mistreatment of black soldiers in the war to the effects of growing up half black, half Asian in post-war Vietnam, to slavery reparations, to the sins of the Founding Fathers, to North Vietnam's attempts during the war to radicalize black soldiers, and for good measure, numerous references to President Donald Trump at one point. One of the characters even has a soliloquy directly into the camera. The movie has a lot on its mind and doesn't hold back what it thinks. It has a long list of injustices and cruelties it wants to expose. The digressions almost feel like the point Lee is going for. He's trying to lay out the laundry list of anti-black and anti-Vietnamese human rights violations to fully explain the motivations of his characters. They aren't just going back to Vietnam for personal wealth. They're going back to get something they believe is owed to them by the culture that oppressed and sent them off to die in a pointless war. Like I said, though, Lee movies I've seen feel at their weakest when their lists and soliloquies, of course, the genre of a treasure hunting story, dictates the mission of a film like this isn't going to go as expected there. Wouldn't be a story if everything went according to plan and everyone got along. Anyone who has seen a film like The Treasure of the Sierra Madre knows that narratives like this aren't unironic stories of men going on journeys for gold only to succeed plentifully. The long march into the jungle is a delve into the soul as well. The 5 members of the Bloods are naturally beset by moments of personal conflict, tragedy, and post-traumatic stress as they relieve their horrific experiences in the jungle and work through their guilt and regrets. They're also confronted by a group of violent Vietnamese gunmen who are implicitly former Viet Cong who also want to find the same treasure. Their allegiances prove to be more complicated. Though Def 5 Bloods is a messy and somewhat pretentious work of art, with a lot of tangents, digressions, and rants, I would never say a Spike Lee film is inauthentic, though, and he certainly fills the space with interesting ideas and melancholy characters. The Vietnam War was one of the most traumatic and regretful wars of the last century, and you can see the weight of that loss that Spike Lee was attracted to in approaching the material he wanted to explore the myriad of ways that black soldiers could never fully come home again, and what it means when they do. Come home to a country they fear hates them. To paraphrase Jacob Knight, it's one part TED Talk and another park cannon. Action film. And there's certainly an audience for that sort of hodgepodge of a movie, Spike. Lee's new movie has a lot to unpack with not much subtlety. Lee has not only crafted a scathing critique of contemporary and historical black experiences in America, the military-industrial complex, patriotism, and capitalism, but also a near tongue-in-cheek subversion of 70s and 80s Cold War-era propaganda franchises, all while paying homage to one of cinema's great stories about the corrupting power of greed, The Five. Bloods is a movie only Lay could have made, and that he made it when he made it as a gift to anyone who likes their movies, topical, smart, and with plenty to say in his long career, Lee has made a name for himself by not pulling any punches. He says what he means, but does so in a way that is both thought-provoking, artistic, and often very funny. The Five Bloods is no different, but somehow the iconic classic filmmaker has managed to wring even more out of his story than usual, using the Vietnam War as a backbone. Lee pulls a double whammy by melding the U.S. war machine dependence on black bodies with modern struggles against police. Brutality and systematic racism to this end, he highlights the often confused concepts of patriotism, duty, and servitude, all while telling a compelling story of brotherhood, family regret, and forgiveness on top of that. Def 5 Bloods pays homage to war films through the ages as both a tribute and critique. Lee pulls off some fun tricks by pointing out that 80s franchises like Rambo and Missing in Action are nothing more than revenge fantasies for bitter jingoists, then subverts this by having his players figuratively refight the war. There's more his use of Wagner Flight of the Valkyries stylistic nods to 1980s platoon lines from the bridge on the River Kugyu, 1957, and Lifted Plot element from Three Kings 1999 and Kelly's Heroes 1970 all contribute healthy doses cinematic flair, while leaving plenty for film buffs to sink their teeth into. And of course, there's the film's direct lineage to John Huston's greed-fueled psychodrama adventure, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, which is handled in such a maddeningly cheesy way that you can see it coming from a mile away, but love it. Anyway, wrap it all up with family drama and PTSD, and a Five Bloods runs the risk of becoming overbearing, but it never crosses the line with help from the tremendous cast. Lee has found a way to make all the politics, references, action, and drama work, and does so on a beautiful, epic, and sometimes surreal scope. There's a lot happening, and that it all fits together and is kept coherent and inventive is a testament to Lee and his abilities above everything. Else the Five Bloods is a sharply emotional film that appeals to a raw sense of morality and empathy that we back. Would be wise to heed this film directed by Lay, written by Danny Bilson. Paul. Deo Kevin Wilman Lay, produced by John Kilik Lay, Beatriz Levin Lloyd. Levin starring Delroy Lindo, Jonathan Major, Clarke Peters, Norm Lewis, Isiah, Whitlock Jr., Melanie Terry, Paul Walter Hauser, Jasper Pina and Janino, Chad Bosman. Cinematography, Newton Thomas, Siegel, edited by Adam Goff, music by Terrence. Blanchard Production Companies, 40 Acres, and a Mule Filmworks Raw Road Lloyd Elvis. Beatriz L. Production, distributed by Netflix, release date June 12, 2020. Running time 156 minutes, country United States language. English budget $35 to $45 million. So, guys, this is the review of the Five Bloods movie and some information about it. How do you like our today's video? Please let us know by commenting. And if you like this video, please like it, share it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.